So in some senses, our pace is slowing, but that really reflects a growth in the weight that we carry, the significance of the work that we're doing, the number of people involved, and the depth of the quality processes that we invest in, and just the sheer size of the community that we carry along now. Those are all good things. They're healthy things at this stage of the development of Fire. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to talk about release 6 and where we're going, what our agendas are going to be, what our priorities are going to be. But release 5 for me is a transition from the preparative process to the finalization process for Fire. So this list is taken from the change list that I prepared for the specification in the history page, which is published as part of the specification, the milestone changes. Now, to make this list, I went through all these changes, 4,157 changes. No, I didn't actually go through all them, but I did scan through the 1,896. That was not a fun couple of days, but I actually scanned through them all and pulled out what I thought were the most significant changes, which I will now work through. So by far the most significant change in release 5 is the rework of the subscriptions framework. For me, this is a really compelling feature that every implementer should be thinking about how much they need it. If you are in a really simple environment where you're connecting a client to a server or doing some patient access, maybe you can get away without a good subscriptions framework. But as soon as you start thinking about wider workflows, efficient workflows, how do you actually make this reliable without hammering the server and the network? You need to start thinking about subscriptions. Now, Gino spoke yesterday about subscriptions, and I stole this slide from Gino's presentation. Thank you, Gino. And I'm not going to go into subscriptions in depth other than the high points. If you want to know more and you didn't catch Gino's presentation, it'll be online within a few hours, apparently. So we reworked them based on a lot of work experience with the existing subscription framework, which we always knew was not particularly strong, a strong framework. When Josh first proposed it to me, I said, well, here's some issues with it. I think that was within 5 minutes. And Josh said, yeah, but let's start somewhere. And then we eventually, then we went back and revisited a few years later. And also based on experience with PubSub in other frameworks, the key change is to remove topics to their own thing, and so move all the heavy engineering into a more controlled space, and let people subscribe to topics and just have more control over how the content of the subscriptions is distributed. And so it leads to more optimized implementations. Now, the fact is that the reworked subscriptions framework was sufficiently important to implementers that we actually backported it to release 4 and release 4B. So what that means is release 4B contains some of the changes that we made to release 5, and there's an implementation guide that describes how you would make the reworked subscriptions framework work on release 4B. And we liked that so much that we went and ported it back again to release 4. Said, if you want to use this stuff in release 4, this is a series of profiles on existing resources that make it work that way. In release 4, there's no way to define topics. You need to basically jump into release 4B or release 5 to do that, but actually defining topics is a pretty specialized thing to do. And so we just focused on making the rest work in release 4. And it's interesting because the single biggest driver to get people to adopt release 5 fell apart as a motivation for release 5 because we made it all available on release 4, except for the topics bit. But that is the single biggest, most significant change in release 5. And I did want to show you if you are interested. This is the subscriptions backport specification that goes through. So it's a backport from R5, not to R5. We really did well on that name, you know. Someone asked me about that. That's right. We don't care about naming things. And so this describes how you can implement the topic-based subscriptions in release 4B and release 4. We did not have any significant appeal for going even further back. Most people are in release 4 space now. All right. Another thing that we did is that we reworked the type framework. So in R4, we have a pretty informal type framework with some special case things that were a little bit odd, and mostly that didn't really bother the implementers, bother you as implementers, but it really bothered people who tried to code generate. They got themselves worked into a tizzy about some things, and there were special cases, and sometimes some of those things suddenly cropped up in object models and so forth. And then there were other challenges around how to profile. For instance, some of you might know about logical models, how do logical models work. And so in release 5, we went back and we defined a proper type framework, which here's the UML diagram for the proper type framework, where we have interfaces and formally defined types. There's all, for those of you who care, fully MOF compliant, proper object definitions. And it's really important for object generators, code generators, and some code generation tools. And just occasionally it'll pop up into typical implementers workflow. In particular, the definition of base in the top corner here is now the new model for base for logical models. And actually I backported base implicitly into the tools for release 4 because we really needed that. And in some senses, I argue with myself about whether I should even list this in this list, because in some senses it's just like meh for a lot of people, but for other people they were really hung up about this. It was a really big deal, but all of these things on this list are like important, really important to some people, and nah to other people. So I listed it here. Another big change that we made in release 5 is that we moved extensions to their own package. So in prior releases, to release 4, we defined a whole bunch of extensions, like the global extensions that everybody can use anywhere in this base specification itself. And we just went ahead and used them. But if you look through HL7 implementation guides, you'll increasingly see extensions cloned all over the place. Exactly the same extension, exactly the same definition, copied and put into a new implementation guide with a new URL, even though it's exactly the same thing. And so I went chasing this, going, why are you doing this? Why? This does not make any sense. They're like, well, we can't refer to the other implementation guide from our implementation guide because of lifecycle issues. And we can't put it in core spec because that won't be published for years yet. And so that effectively was becoming a source of real design confusion within HL7. So when we published release 5, we moved the extensions into a separate package. So I'll just show you what that looks like in the specification. Here we are. We're going to look at patient. So we're in the core specification, and we go and look at the extensions. So first of all, up here, you can't see this. I know, but I can't see this because Zoom just popped up. But we are in this page as part of the core specification. And we click on extensions here, and now we're seeing the extensions list for patient. We're now in the extensions package, actually in /extensions, and it's a separate publication with a separate NPM package underlying it. And you can see that the box at the top here is changed. This is part of the Fire Core Extensions Registry, not part of the Fire Core specification. And in particular, the whole point of this is it will iterate more quickly. And my hope is that we'll get to a point where we pretty much publish it 3 times a year. Every few months we'll publish an update. These pages will update, the details of the extensions might update. And so we can start actually publishing this list of extensions more frequently. And the first one won't be 3 months because we're still getting into gear. And in particular, we're still arguing about exactly what kind of changes we can make to the extensions and just keep rolling them on. And so we generally agree about most changes, but not all. In particular, and this is going to be a more general issue for us, which I'll talk about tomorrow with release 6. When we are now in the context of having a pretty mature specification with mature content, but adding experimental things to play with. And so how does that, like if we add an extension and then the user community says to us, nah, got that one wrong, we need to change it a bit. In principle, if everybody agrees, who's using it agrees that we can just make a breaking change to it when it's very immature, we can go ahead and make a breaking change to it. And everyone just deals with that because everybody agreed. But like, how do we get everybody, how do we know that we've got everybody who needs to agree? How much change can we make in that framework? We're still working through some of those issues around, experimental content. Once we've sort of said, well, that's it, it's, got to maturity level 3 or something like that, we're not going to make any changes to it. It's just too hard. But if maturity level 1 that's been published once and a few people looked at it and said, I would use it if it, then maybe we should. So we're still talking about that. But hopefully we can sort that out and start publishing updates to the extensions. And although you can define extensions in implementation guides and in the registry and in Simplifier, and lots of people do, there's a very definite significance of having extensions defined on this page. Much more people are going to find them and use them. And they sort of have more approval based on what HL7 thinks about them. All right. The other thing that it includes in the extensions pack, perhaps due to convenience more than anything else, is the translation content for the scripts to express the relationship between release 4 and release 5. They are also in the extensions pack so that we can update them, although we haven't yet received any reports of issues with them. So we'll see. All right. During the preparation of release 5, the committee that owns the RESTful API and search pages received a lot of commentary about the pages. And we actually did pretty significant structural rewrite to the search pages, to the search page. They are normative pages, which means that we don't make breaking changes to those pages. But we did add quite a lot of clarification language, including some actual shall statements. The committee believed, based on its research, that none of those changes were actually going to break implementations. They were all in the nature of clarifications, things that were not clearly expressed, where we believed that the only possible way to understand it was the way that we clarified it to be. In a couple of places, we wished that we could clarify something to a shall, but we were not able to. But generally, I'm talking about these kind of clarifications that are, you might call them clarifications with teeth. We recommend that everybody, first of all, regards these clarifications as retrospectively applying to release 4, because they're actually clarifications. So if you're implementing release 4, you should actually read the release 5 pages, because they will tell you, in case of lack of clarity, what we believe to be the case in release 4. But like I said, we don't think that they're breaking. But honestly, if we were really, really convinced about that, we wouldn't have had to clarify. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about that. So I recommend that everybody reads those pages and checks the difference. And so if you really, it's the easiest way to find the difference is actually to click on those links there in this slide when I update the slide, upload the slides, which I will, to actually see a difference analysis between the R4 page and the R5 page. So there should not be changes that you think are breaking here, but it's always worth checking. And we have a long list of types that we added, renamed, or deleted. I'm going to go look at a couple that we added, including one that mystifyingly did not make the list, and some new types and some resources we renamed. But we removed a number of resources. So catalog entry was a resource that we added in release 4. It was very low maturity, which was around describing catalogs of items, laboratory test procedure catalog or medication catalog. On reflection and after further development, the committee realized that we didn't need a resource for that. And so we retired the resource and made profiles on existing resources. We also removed document manifest. So document manifest was really defined, I defined it as a match to the XDS document manifest. And after much work on IAG came back to us and said, well, we're not using it because we're going to use list. And we looked at it and said, well, really, if we define it for IAG and they're not going to use it, and they're going to use list, and we think list is better anyway. So we removed document manifest with an instruction to just, it's a list of documents, go use list. Not everybody was thrilled by that, but we did that. Perhaps more controversially to me, at least, we also removed media and said, really, media is just a special kind of observation. And so we don't need media as a separate resource. We'll just call it an observation. So that got moved to observation. And we had a few very speculative resources in the evidence-based medicine and the research trial management space, which we removed and rechanged the way we were doing those resources. I mean, there's a bit of a arbitrary thing for me. Do I say they were renamed to some other resource that works differently, or do I just say we got rid of them and did something different? And then there's the whole medication definition section, which we're still very immature and working up with the regulation agencies, which is EMA and TGA in Australia and FDA. Where a lot of sweeping changes in that space because still was very immature. It's starting to get mature in R5. If you're interested in that space, you're going to be interested in R5. So there's actually a lot of changes here, and I want to call out two particular changes of significance. Two particular resources that we added are actor definition and requirements. Now, I'm calling them out for you because they're going to start appearing in implementation guides. They're not going to start appearing in implementations, right? And they're so significant at the implementation guide level, we actually backported them to release 4 in the implementation guides. So you can find actor definitions and requirements we will start finding them in implementation guides. They're actually resources that you could implement in R5, but we're not going to backport the implementations of them. Actor definition allows you to define systems and users that are involved in exchanges. In release 4, you can already do that as part of an example scenario, but now we moved them out into their own thing so we can reference them as independent entities. You can define obligations associated with them, and obligations is something that is at the moment in the tooling IG. Here's the tooling IG. Playing around with actor definitions and requirements and defining a bunch of backports of R5 and R6 concepts. Obligations are taking must support and saying, well, actually, what does must support mean exactly for which actors? So now we can say, if you're a server, you need to populate this field if you have it. If you're a client, you need to display this field if it's present. And we actually be very specific about the obligations on applications, and we link them to actor definitions. And we can also define requirements, which are formal statements of requirements in a classic requirement sense. And then we can trace where the requirements come from, and also what features of the implementation, capability statements and profiles and value sets, which requirements led to those. Not every implementation guide author is going to want to spend the time doing requirements tracing, but a number of implementation guide authors told us that was a real big deal for them. They needed to do that, and we didn't have a framework for doing that. So irrespective of the version of the IG, the version of FIRE that the IG is describing, implementation guides can now use actor definitions and requirements and obligations and trace all those things. And we're starting to see them appearing in implementation guides. The editors are working on them, and obligations are slated for core in release 6, and Lloyd is going to talk about this stuff in more detail later today. Another thing we did was we moved most code systems value sets out of the core into terminology.hl7.org. And we did that, so again, for update frequency and for getting more reuse in other HL7 specifications. FIRE specifications liberally reuse terminologies out of version 2 and CDA, but they couldn't do the same for terminologies we defined. And so we moved them into terminology.hl7.org. We did not move value sets and code systems bound to code elements with required bindings, because they're really part of the design of the resource. You can't just change them without, like balloting a new resource. So those ones stayed in the core spec as part of the design of the resource. But anything else that's preferred binding or a codable concept or example bindings or whatever, they all moved out to terminology.hl7.org. And at a tooling level, for those of you who care, the package hl7.terminology.r, whatever version you're using, that's always in scope. You don't have to reference it explicitly. The tools need to know that terminology is just always part of, it's effectively part of core. The same applies to extensions. Extensions and terminology packages depend on core, and so the core can't depend on them, and so they're sort of magically part of core. Also, we added operations for very large resources. So there's implementations out there where we've cited group and list resources with more than 100,000 entries. Concept maps can get quite big too, so I'm gonna have to think about that, or we will have to think about that. But we've seen resources much bigger than 1 megabyte in size. I have yet to see a resource out of a prototype production system that's bigger than 100 meg. It starts to get pretty difficult at that size, and we never intended that to be something that worked really well. When you get to a resource in that size, out past a megabyte on a RESTful API, it's starting to become problematic. It's just an engineering challenge. It's not a conceptual challenge, it's just more. But the time taken to fetch the resource, update the resource locally on a mobile client, starting to get difficult, post it back to the server's parsing it, making the checking business rules, committing it to the database. It's just slow. And it might become a functional challenge if your actual change frequency is quicker than the time taken to actually make the change. Then you have a functional disaster. And it's sort of inherent to me that a resource with 100,000 entries is a resource that gets a lot of changes made to it. So we defined some special operations that you can call, say, I don't want the resource, just tell me if this item's in it, or put this item in it, or take an item out of it. So you don't have to load the whole resource. And they're way quicker once you get to these really big resources. We also defined a way to add additional bindings. In R4, coded elements can have a single binding to a value set, and that's the one that the validator uses to check. When we actually sat down and looked at what people were doing in real life, they were doing all sorts of variations around. In some contexts, we have additional binding rules with, like in, for instance, IPS. It's one value set in all cases, but in a lot of countries can say, well, we can narrow that value set down. We can document current bindings and components of value sets. So current binding is where the law says you have to use this value set, but there's lots of legacy records that don't use that value set. We can provide useful UI subsets like a 500 common UCOM terms for people, and it reduces the need for slicing. And this is such a significant thing that we backported that too with an extension in tooling IG, and there's examples of its use in IPS and also in release 5 around language. So I said, lots of changes, and most of these changes are in response to implementation feedback. So you should look at them. Like if you really, even if you're implementing R4, you should actually go and look in R5 and say, what do we do to this in R5? You might be implementing saying, how do you use this field? It's not really clear to me how my use case works in release 4. Go read a release 5 and see what we said. We might have said something about that because someone said, oh, no, it's not really not clear. And sometimes we responded to that by redesigning, and you're like, oh, well, at least I know why I'm in trouble. Other times we might have clarified or given some suggestions. So it's worth reading release 5. If you are interested, release 5 includes for every resource and type, a list of the changes between release 4 and release 5. They're also available as JSON and XML files, should you want to process them, and a few people do. And then there's the transforms in mapping language between release 4 and release 5. So we provided these transforms for 2 reasons. One is you could actually feed them into a transform engine, and that there are transform engines and they do work, and we tested them. But also you can just read them as a human and say, these are formal executable maps from release 4 to release 5 or vice versa. So they serve as human documentation, very technically precise and not the easiest way to read, but proven that they work, something for that. And so they're worth reading if you're in the business of transitioning from 4 to 5. They're not always completely successful. You'll see in them that Vadim and Vasil and who I can't remember on the top of my head who else, but sometimes we would look at a change between release 4 and release 5 and go, it's too big. We don't know how to do this. We're not going to try. We're just going to comment this line out. So it's not entirely successful. All right. So now to finish up with, should you move to release 5? The first thing, and a lot of people have asked me this, and this is my standard advice around the world. The first thing is, do you need the new things in release 5? And have they been or can they be backported? Some of them can, some of them can't, with interversion extensions or with backport IGs or with special support in the tools. And if they haven't or can't be backported, how much will you benefit otherwise? Now, there's some projects out there doing release 5 because they need those new things in the release 5 implementation guide. The next question to ask is, how much is it going to cost us? And that's like, how big is your ecosystem? How much is your change overhead? If you have a lot of extensive testing and regulatory oversight, then your change cost will be greater. But if your ecosystem is thousands of parties, how are you going to change? So for most existing systems and ecosystems and trading partners and companies and national programs that I talk to, the cost benefit says we're not going to adopt release 5 at this time, at least. Although it's pretty hard to come to terms with the cost benefit of the 4,000 changes, right? And it's my opinion, we've seen this before. When we released release 2, everyone said, right, stop. We're going to stick with release 2. And then the next minute they came back and said, can we get into release 3, please? I don't think it's going to be quite so quick, but we're just waiting to see how that cost benefit plays out for people. But as I said, even if you're not implementing release 5, and my advice is only do that if you really know why you're doing it. But even if you're not, you should still be reading release 5 because it's got important advice for implementing release 4. Right. So we had some time for some questions.
Well, thank you very much. It is indeed now time for the Q&A.
Thanks. I have a question concerning the terminology. What's the consequence of moving out the optional value sets and code systems to the terminology server? Do I have to be more often online in my
they
developer
moved-
pipeline?
they're not actually moved to a terminology server per se. They were always available on the terminology server and in the package. They're still available in the package. It's just a different package. And the tools automatically bring them into scope. So as a consumer, that hasn't really changed that balance. Most of the value sets that we moved are ones with reasonably small expansions. But I do think, looking at it longer term, the fact that they're in terminology.hl7.org increases the chance that we'll start getting more and more expansive value sets, which you really need a terminology server to deal with. Although my general advice to all implementers in all contexts is you are inevitably going to run into value sets where the expansion is considerably large. If you are trying to do clinical work in the hope that you won't run into that kind of value set, you're going to be disappointed. So you should have a terminology server in your framework so that you can deal with those, because they will happen. Medications, problems, whatever. It's my general advice to people. But those changes haven't really changed it. We're just sort of on the inevitable path towards terminology services everywhere.
Thanks, Grahame. Yes, sir, in the Q&A, you and Lloyd and Ewout, I don't know who said it, but one of you mentioned that in the future, resources are expected to be more stable between releases. Fire resources don't have a version number, and the expectation could be that it doesn't matter so much which release you use. So if we do not use any of the removed or added resources between R2, R4, and R5, what problems could you expect in a mixed environment?
So for me, in the implementation guide publisher, concept map changed significantly between release 4 and release 5. And I spent many painful nights banging my head on the wall, wishing that it hadn't changed. Patient and observation didn't change or didn't have any breaking changes in them. I think encounter is something that almost everybody will run into, and encounters had some pretty significant changes. I think that if you're working with consent, the changes between consent in release 4 and release 5 are subtly dangerous. They look very minimal, but when you actually think about how a consent engine would work, and basically, if you wrote a consent engine for R4, we kind of pulled the carpet from under it. And so that's, even though it looks like a really minor change, we took away the consent at the base, the consent provision at the base. Just, it was a pretty big change. Other than that, I mean, care plan, we took a lot of details out of care plan and delegated them to the other resources and duplicating them a simplified version in care plan. If you're doing care planning, you'll really notice that. But I could go on, right? Every single resource where we could say we made a little change here, and someone's going to come to me and say, you pulled the carpet from us, because it's a really significant change, even though it looks insignificant and it was only one element. So it's really difficult to go beyond what I've said, but those are the things that have stood out for me talking to implementers and doing my own implementation work.
Any other questions?
No, just to mention on that last one, the other, I think, significant one is the resource binding all types versus version independent all types for things like search parameter and things like that, that the binding changed in R5, and it's, again, a very subtle difference, but to run into.
Yeah, I mean, some of those, that's another great example of something obscure that most people would never notice, but made Gino bang his head on the wall.
Good morning, Grahame.
Mario, how surprising.
Greetings. I have a general question.
Okay.
On publishing a standard.
Mhm.
We've gone final with version 5.0.0. sitting back at an industry level, when I look at what we're doing with R4, the existence of R4B, now R5, and your enjoyable talk on R6 later today, I wonder if we're not going too fast in some cases. In my world, I use the word stress when we stress test standards and specifications. And from that perspective, that word stress means, do we give the industry a chance to really operationalize and go through the implementation guides, through the implementation process, and actually get it out there, living, breathing, and get the feedback? If we go final on these things too quickly and they haven't been stressed, then when the industry is actually out there working, their feedback we can't incorporate. Like so I just would ask you, as a product director and thinking about fire's future and where R6 will fit in the lifespan of fire, is there a benefit? Could we have taken R5 and said, listen, it's in alpha or it's in beta, we're not making any more changes, get the IG authors out there writing, updating the IGs, get them out into production and just fight? I know it's hard because you're trying to get closure and you're trying to get done, and I like done, but are we a little bit upside down in the way we approach finalizing something before it's actually been stressed? And that, for me, Mario, in a world of stress.
Thanks, Mario. I mean, I recognize the concept of a world of stress. In a sense, you could regard R5 as the beta for R6, for instance. We gave people a intermediary to focus on and stress test for us. In fact, you could regard R4 as the beta for R5, which is the beta for R6. I mean, it's a cycle we live in, but we need to give people a stable to actually stress test. And in a sense, all that we've done to this point has been that cycle. And the industry is, I mean, as product director, I had a lot of feedback about this subject. There's the process that we were on to work up a standard for trial use to experiment with what works best. And that has, you know, a whole bunch of benefits to recommend to it. But when you turn to the healthcare industry and they just want a standard that works so they can, you know, go ahead and have stable, perfect standard. And I mean, you can't square that circle. But when I talk about R6, which I hope is tomorrow, I haven't done the slides yet, but when I talk about R6, I will get into this in much more detail about, because our philosophy is certainly changing in response to market feedback with pros and cons, and I'll be talking about that when I talk about R6.
I think those were all the questions we had time for. I would like to thank you today. And hopefully, and thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day. What you do on a first is feeling. Put it to my heart, I'll let you in. Now you're gonna price for your